Story time about how I found out my husband gave me HIV while I was pregnant. So, me and my husband were high school sweethearts. He was very kind, very in tune about my feelings, and we were like best friends. We never really did anything sexual because he didn't want our relationship to be like that. We were together for 6 years, waited until marriage to lose our virginity to one another. The year before getting married, I noticed he would stare at guys a lot, but I would never really think anything about it because at least he was not looking at girls. Fast forward, we get married, and 2 years later, I get pregnant, and we were both excited. When I get to the doctors, I get my yearly test done for STDs, of course, but as always, I'm clean. Maybe 1 or 2 weeks later, I get a call from the doctor saying I tested positive for HIV. Let me know if you guys want a part 2. Part 2 of how I found out my husband gave me HIV while I was pregnant. Like I said earlier, 2 weeks later, I get a call from the doctor saying I tested positive for HIV. I was shaking and crying, and I was so shocked. And the only thing I ever heard about HIV at the time was that I only had a couple months to live. I couldn't believe the only man that I've ever been with gave me this disease. I thought I was doing everything right, the right way, and still ended up being in a hole. I was so nervous to confront my husband because I didn't think it was like him to cheat on me, and I thought maybe he thought I was cheating. So the next day I pretended everything was fine. I lied to him and told him that my phone died and that I needed his to call my mother. He gave me his phone. I went into the bathroom and immediately I start snooping. As I'm going through his phone, I didn't see any texts from girls, so I'm like, maybe the doctor got the wrong test. I'm running out of time. Come back for part 3. Part 3 of how I found out my husband gave me HIV while I was pregnant. So, like I said, I went to his phone and I didn't see any texts from other girls. So, I'm thinking maybe the doctor called the wrong person. Anyways, I gave up on looking through his phone and I just talked to him. I sat him down and told him that I had HIV and that I haven't cheated on him ever. He looked at me and cried. He broke down in tears and apologized. I got so upset with him because I realized that he did cheat on me, and I was really upset for our unborn child. So I took all of his clothes, I took his things, and I threw them all out. Right before I kicked him out, I yelled at him saying, "Who was the girl that gave it to you?" And he told me it wasn't a girl. It was his friend David. Story time of how my parents forced me to marry a 40-year-old man when I was 14, but most people from my country, it is called arranged marriage, and it happened to a lot of girls. My family was poor, but the guy I was marrying had a lot of money and promised to take care of me and my family. He also had a 6-year-old son, but he didn't like me. I had met him once before when my mother introduced him to us. She allowed me to stay with him alone. He was very touchy. He told me I was very beautiful and would spoil me because pretty girls like me deserve pretty things. After he left, I told my parents that I was scared to marry him and that I'll do more housework and I'll take care of my other little sisters. My father yelled at me and told me no. So the next week, I went throughout the whole wedding crying. My mom told me to stop because I was messing up my makeup. After we had got married, a couple months later, he grew very abusive. Part 2 will be up next. This is part 2 of how my parents forced me to marry a 40-year-old man and I was 14. So we got married, and a couple months into the relationship, he became abusive. Whenever my food tasted nasty or something wasn't clean right, he called me a lazy wife and told me I was no good and he should have married someone else. His 6-year-old son had no respect for me. The little boy scratched me, would yell at me, throw stuff at me, and my husband wouldn't do anything about it. I would tell him that I didn't like how his son was treating me, and he stood up and tells me to stay in my place and tells me I'm just a bad mother. I'd cried every night, wishing I could go back home to my mother and father. 2 years later, when I turned 16, I found out I was pregnant. He was so happy about it, and for once, he treated me so sweet. He would cook for me, clean, and told his son to be nice because his little brother was in there. When we found out the baby was a girl, he got mad and walked out on me. Part 3 will be up next. This is part 3 of how my parents forced me to marry a 40-year-old man and I was 14. So my husband was excited that I was pregnant, but when he found out I was having a baby girl, he got very upset and walked out of the room. When we got home, he started treating me nasty again. He then started putting his hands on me. He was just very angry at me and never wanted to see his daughter. It took him 3 weeks before picking her up. But even then, he wanted nothing to do with her. As years went on, I became quiet and I wouldn't speak to him. I would just make sure our home was clean and the children were taken care of. He would just get upset with me that I wouldn't speak to him and accuse me of cheating. He claimed that I was sleeping with other men and that our daughter is probably not even his child. I never understood why, because I was always home because he didn't allow me to go out. But I soon realized he only accused me of cheating because he was cheating the entire time. Part 4 is coming up soon. This is part 4 of how my parents forced me to marry a 40-year-old man and I was 14. My husband would always accuse me of cheating, but I found out he only accused me because he was cheating on me the entire time. Ended up finding out because his son told me. And like I said earlier, his son never liked me in the first place. So when I had made him upset, he randomly said that's why my dad has a new woman. I was off about it, so I went to ask my husband about it, and he admitted to it. He was very blunt about it, and he told me it was because the lady tempted him. I believed him at the time, but as time grew on, I started to become very insecure. I'd do whatever he want, but it was never good enough because he still kept stepping out of our marriage. On my 19th birthday is when I realized I had to figure out a way for me and my daughter to leave him. He didn't even say happy birthday to me, and that was my husband. I had no money, I didn't own anything, but I took a chance, so I packed whatever I could, and I planned for me and my daughter to run away while he went to work. This is part 5 of how my parents forced me to marry a 40-year-old man, and I was 14. So like I said before, I made a plan for me and my daughter to run away while he went to work. When he left, I packed up food, clothes, and took money that we saved up just in case something happened. I woke my daughter up out of her sleep and I told her we need to go. I woke up son up and I told him we were going to the store and that we would be right back. He went right back to sleep and I gathered our things and took me and my daughter to the train station. She asked where we were going and I told her we were going to see our other family. When we got on the train, my daughter went to sleep and I cried because of all the pain I was put through with my husband. I left and I wasn't able to say goodbye to my mother, father, or any of my younger sisters. I didn't want any of them to know because I knew they were going to try to send me back. And leaving was the best decision that I made of my life. It's now been 23 years and I found my now husband and we're living a better life.
This story time is why I stopped being friends with a girl because her dad was a pervert. And we're calling her Kim. So me and Kim became friends at school. Over time, we realized we lived close together. So she started coming over to my house and I started going over to hers. She had 5 brothers and she was the only girl. Whenever I'd come over to her house, I'd say hello to everyone, but her dad was always excited to see me. He'd immediately run and give me a hug. Over the past couple months, he'd give me a hug and a kiss on the cheek. He said that I was his new little girl. I felt uncomfortable with it, but I went and told my friend Kim, and she said, he's just glad you're here, and you're like family now. I was like, okay, I guess, and I would just ignore it. Thanksgiving come up, and I went over to her house for a plate. Her dad opened up the door and gave me a hug and a kiss, as usual. I walked in the house, and he said, you need to eat to keep that booty plump. I laughed in nervousness, and he slapped and squeezed my butt. There's more that happened after this. Let me know if you guys want a part 2. This is part 2 of why I stopped being friends with the girl because her dad was a pervert. So remember how I told y'all I came over for Thanksgiving? Her dad slapped and squeezed my butt. I was weirded out, but I laughed to hide how nervous and anxious I was. After I get a plate of food and I sit down with Kim, I told her dad slapped my butt. And she was like, yeah, okay, as if she didn't believe me. So again, I ignored the situation. As the day goes on, everyone is playing board games, laughing, and eating desserts. I had cheesecake and I'm lactose intolerant, and you know how that went. I left the family for a few minutes and I go to the bathroom. When I was all finished, I opened up the door and there was Kim's dad just sitting there smiling at me. I was like, oops, my bad. You were probably waiting for a while. Here you go. And I tried to move out of the way, but then he says, I don't need to go to the bathroom. He pushes me back in by the hips and locks the door. It gets really bad after this. Y'all let me know if I should make a part 3. This is part 3 of why I stopped being friends with the girl because her dad was a pervert. So after her dad pushes me back into the bathroom and locks the door, he's sitting there smiling at me and I asked him very nervously if I did something wrong. He was like, yes, you haven't been spending time with daddy. And he likes to jiggle my breasts in a weird way. At this point, I was backing up because he starts acting weird. Then he starts unzipping his pants and gets closer to me. And guys, their bathroom wasn't that big. I immediately took the Windex that was on top of their toilet and sprayed it into his eyes and quickly ran out of the bathroom. After this, her dad starts yelling. While I'm coming downstairs, everyone asks what's going on. I told the whole family what Kim dad has done, and one of their little brothers yells at me, calling me a whore. I then went to Kim saying, you gotta believe me, that's what happened. She's like, my dad would never do anything like that. Her mom walks up to me and tells me that I should leave. I starts crying, and then her mom yells at me and tells me to go home. So I left and went home crying. After that, I never went back over to her house.
This story time is how I found out my boyfriend lied about his age. At the time, I was 15 and I found out he was 32. By the way, we're calling him Jake. So I met Jake at a college party and I was able to go because my sister had just entered college and I begged her to take me. So I had fun. I ended up meeting Jake, and from there we started talking. He told me he was still in college, and of course I told him I was still in high school. At the time he told me he was 18 and he slightly looked older, but I guess he just looked older for his age. And I know we weren't supposed to date at these ages, but my dad was 5 years older than my mom, and I didn't think that it was that bad being 3 years apart. We were together for 10 months. When my birthday came around, he wanted to take me out on a date. He picked me up from home and drove me to a restaurant, and 5 minutes before we get to the restaurant, he gets pulled over for not having his lights on. The cops asked for his ID, he showed the cops, and he put it down. I took a look at his ID, and it said he was born in the 1980s. It gets really bad after this. Let me know.
This is part 2 of how I found out my boyfriend lied about his age. At the time, I was 15, and I found out he was 32. So like I said earlier, he had got pulled over by the cops, and he asked for his ID. When he had got it back, he had put his ID in his cup holder. I took a glance, and I saw he was born in the 1980s. When the cops left, we drove off. Then I asked him, Jake, how old are you again? He's like, 18. Why'd you ask that? I picked up his ID and pushed it into his face. He quickly steps on the brake and snatches it from me. I was like, take me home. He said, no, it's a fake ID. I was like, what do you need a fake ID for? Where's your real one? He looked at me in shock. Then I told him I wanted to leave. I try to open up the car door to leave, and he tells me, you're not going nowhere. Guys, this is when it gets really scary. Y'all let me know if y'all want to part.
This is part 3 of how I found out my boyfriend lied about his age. At the time, I was 15, and I found out he was 32. Okay, so like I said before, I saw his ID, and I could tell he was lying about how it was fake. So I immediately wanted to get out. I try to open up the door, but it doesn't open. I told him to let me out. He responds, you're not going anywhere, and you're not leaving me. I then start pushing on him to get me out. He stops and says, if you keep pushing on me, we're going to crash. So I grab my phone and I call the police. He took my phone and threw it out the window. And I'm like, where the hell are you taking me? Guys, this is when it gets really dangerous. Y'all let me know if I should make a part.